Okay, racism and the denial of informed consent, Tuskegee. The Tuskegee syphilis study is perhaps the country's most infamous case of a racial minority being used as guinea pigs without their consent. This actually understates the immense injustice which occurred. As we shall see, not only were the participants in the study not informed of the true nature and purpose of the study, they were actively deceived so that they would not seek out effective treatment of a deadly disease. Furthermore, all of this deception unto death was carried out merely to satisfy the curiosity of the researchers, as this research had zero value in relation to eventually treating everyone for syphilis. Let's go to a slide. Another important thing to note about this is that it reveals that scientists, doctors, and other types of medical researchers are not immune to the prejudices of the general culture of which they are a part. It's not only racial prejudice which has influenced medical professionals. Various gender and class biases have had a large effect as well. Brand's focuses on the racial biases against black people, which permeated American culture, especially in the South, well into the latter 20th century. Here are the background details of this study. The study began in 1932 in Alabama. 600 black men were enrolled, 400 of whom were infected with syphilis. Even though effective treatments for syphilis were available, first in the form of arsenic therapy and later on in the form of penicillin, the men were never offered real treatment for syphilis, even though the study lasted into the early 1970s. Of course, the men were all told they were receiving treatment, as the conductors of the study didn't want any of them to drop out. We'll examine the purpose of this study shortly. First, let's look at the racist ideologies which permeated the American medical establishment in the early 20th century. Social Darwinist racism. It was a commonly held belief among anthropologists, ethnologists, and biologists that the black race was essentially primitive in comparison with the white race. Blacks were thought to be the lowest species in the Darwinian hierarchy. Brand notes that many white intellectuals thought the black race was headed towards extinction, since they weren't fit to survive in a complex civilization. Now, one of the most common errors in thinking among racist so-called intellectuals is a tendency to ignore the effects of culture on a minority group and assume that all struggles that group is facing is a result of genetic inferiority. For example, these anthropologists were impressed by the fact that blacks suffered high rates of venereal disease and poverty upon being liberated from slavery. This reinforced the already standing idea that black people were better off as slaves. Some of the specific racial stereotypes which were believed at the time involved the claim that blacks were hypersexual and especially drawn to white women. This was thought to endanger the foundations of white society. They were also believed to be generally intellectually and morally inferior. Furthermore, even characteristic physical traits, which are clearly a matter of mere aesthetic taste, were viewed as defects. These stereotypes caused white intellectuals to view black men as incapable of following a regimen of treatment for syphilis, especially in the latent phases. Now, a little objective reasoning should cause one to realize that a group of persons who are kept as illiterate slaves for over a century should be expected to struggle for many generations upon being liberated, especially when they are still trapped in a culture whose politically dominant members see them as inferior and untrustworthy. Of course, black people struggled with poverty. They were systematically denied opportunities for advancement and didn't have the experience of making decisions for themselves due to the institution of slavery and the Jim Crow laws, which were immediately instituted when slavery ended. Next slide. In 1929, a study was undertaken using finances from the Rosenwald Fund. United States Public Health Service wanted to discover how prevalent syphilis was in the rural South in order to determine the potential for mass treatment. Their study concluded that mass treatment could be effective if sufficient resources were used. The Tuskegee study was a direct descendant of that study. This is, however, ironic since the purpose of Dr. Clark's and Dr. Cummings' Tuskegee study was merely to observe the progression of syphilis throughout the lifetime of a variety of contaminated persons. They had absolutely no intent to treat persons with the illness. Dr. Clark was actually co-author of the report on the Rosenwald study. He ignored his own findings out of mere scientific curiosity. He wanted to know more about syphilis, and he thought a unique opportunity had arisen to chart its development. Clark and Cumming had the vice of a vicious curiosity. The patient's well-being was not something they were at all concerned about. Rather, they pursued knowledge of a disease simply for the sake of knowledge. Between the years of 1890 and 1910, a study of untreated venereal disease was conducted in Oslo, Norway. In the Oslo study, the men were left untreated because all available treatments were incredibly toxic. Indeed, they were as bad or worse than untreated syphilis and yielded little benefit. In 1910, an effective treatment for syphilis was discovered, and the Oslo study was ended so that the study participants could receive the treatment. A certain type of arsenic, although toxic itself, was shown to be effective on the vast majority of patients who used the treatment. Whereas 30% of persons with syphilis who were left untreated either died or suffered severe mental and physical damage, only 5% of persons treated with arsenic suffered the same fate. Clark and Cummings got the idea for their study from having read the Oslo study reports. Hence, it's clear once again that they knew of an effective treatment for syphilis before beginning their own study. Here is what is so difficult about curing the intellectual vice of racism. Data is not enough, since the racist so easily finds ways to interpret the data to support his or her own prejudices and chosen racist policies. Even the Oslo study reported that an effective cure was available, Clark and Cummings convinced themselves and their funders that syphilis in black people was fundamentally different than syphilis in white people. This is because black people themselves were said to be practically a different species from white people. They also believed that black people were too irresponsible to use an extended treatment regimen over time, especially when the disease was in its latent form. By making these false assumptions, they justified proceeding with their own study. As it turns out, the assumptions made about black people regarding infection rates and their desire to follow through with treatment were false. The researchers predicted that 35% of the black men in Macon County would have syphilis. Part of their racist ideology was that black men had a more powerful sexual appetite than white men and were more careless. Only 20% of black men in the county actually had syphilis. Also, the vast majority were interested in receiving long-term treatment and regularly showed up for exams over a 40-year period. So much of the assumption that black men lacked common sense and the ability to follow through. The black men continued to show up for care because they were told they were actually being treated, which they were not, which was not true. Indeed, the researchers looked forward to the day when syphilis would kill them so that detailed autopsies on their dead bodies could be conducted. The men, of course, had to be deceived further into thinking that such autopsies would not be conducted. Hence, as you can see, the overarching goal of the study was to satisfy the research team's curiosity. They positively desired the death of their research subjects so they could gather more data. Even in 1950, when a fully effective treatment for syphilis with no side effects became available, hence undermining any possible reason for continuing the study, they went to great lengths to persuade the men not to take penicillin and remain in the study until their death. No criminal charges have ever been filed against anyone associated with these studies.